Good morning. Right. So for attendance, again, I'm just going to call out names of people who are not here or are not online. So I'll call your name, let me know, and I should. Carr, Dunlap, Smith, Newton, Faulkner, Stanley, Sims, and I think that's it. Everybody else is either online or here in person. All right, we'll do some attendance. I guess I'll start with attendance announcements, even though I didn't write it in that order. Just as a reminder, if you're online, make sure you send me the keywords before 9 a.m. today. I guess the first keyword today will be library, since one of the people who aren't here, they're not here because of the library. So library is the first word for attendance. To remind you, some people are really behind on attendance, and if you've missed a class, you can go back and watch the video. Granted, it's too late to get full credit, but half credit is better than no credit. So if you're missing any days, you should go back and watch the videos, answer the questions, so you can get full credit. If you're wondering which days you're missing, then you should look at the spreadsheet that I gave you guys. The grade spreadsheet. You can see your grade and see exactly which days you're missing. Which is a good time to segue into office hours. I told you last week on Friday, from now on, I'm going to start giving you guys extra credit for meeting me at least once a week, whether it's in line or online or in person, or during office hours or outside of office hours. If you just meet with me, I would say, let's just do 2 points per week. I know it's not much, but all you have to do is meet with me. Say, hey, I'm just checking in. And if I got something I need to update you with, like, hey, you're doing really good on this. You might want to focus a little bit more on your labs, or don't forget you still have this assignment missing. I just want to catch up with you and let you know how you specifically can improve your score. And of course, it'd be even better if you had questions for me, but you don't have to. If you just show up in person or online and let me briefly tell you what you can do better that week.
And what time?
Anytime. So office hours are 9 to 10:40. So if you just drop in online or in person, then I'll be there. Anytime after that, we just have to schedule it. So office, it's like we can meet outside of office hours. Just office hours is when you're guaranteed. So yeah, let me know, guys. Sort of on the same note, remind you, Google, you guys should definitely read the announcements on Google Classroom. Even after saying this on Friday, people still haven't done it. So most of the times when I post an announcement, I'll put on there, hey, if you read this, reply to this and tell me you read it and you get extra points. I told you that on Friday, and then I made one of those announcements, and still people haven't read it and sent me back an email saying, hey, I read this, can I get some extra points? It's free points. So anyway, read the Google announcements. And then lab, I'll remind you, whatever your grade was for the pre-lab last week is now your pre-lab grade for this week, unless you made some changes, and I know some of you have. And technically the due date for that was last night, but I haven't graded it yet. So as long as it's done before I get around to grading it, I'm going to consider that on time. So if you're hearing this right now, and then you leave class and think, all right, I didn't make any corrections, I better do it. Yes, go ahead and do it. As long as you get it done before I get around to grading your paper, as far as I'm concerned, that's on time. Some of you, if you had full credit for pre-lab last week, then obviously you don't need to worry about it, because you already got 5 points. Whew. And then lab. Lab will be like regular lab this week. We're going to meet Wednesday at noon here in class, not in person. Don't make any appointments or anything like that. You need to be here for lab, especially this one. This is a really important one. This is the one you're going to write a lab report about. Whew. That's it for announcements, I think. Any questions? No?
I have one.
Good. Questions are great. Well, yeah.
So for the independent work points, right?
Mm-hmm.
We gotta get 100 by when?
By the end of the semester. And technically, when you break that down, I think it's like technically it's 7 point something points per week, which almost doesn't matter unless you're a student athlete, because when you hammer those things, like, hey, what's my grade? Then your grade that day is based on how much independent work you've done. Because technically by now you're supposed to have, as of today, you should have, 45.6 points technically. But even if you have 0 right now, as long as you have 100 by the end of the semester, that's all that matters. But again, if you're asking me what your grade is today, and you don't have, 45 points of independent work, then that would negatively affect your grade technically. That make sense? Right. You can still recover from it completely, but yeah, technically that's how that works. So yeah, good question. A lot of you haven't even started independent work yet. So I really highly recommend it because some of you, as you know, sometimes it's not as easy as you think. Right? You write a paper and then I write back to you like, I can't accept this. But if you do that now, you're good because you learn from your mistakes. But if you do that on the last week of school, then you're like, you send me a bunch of papers and I write back like, I can't accept this. And then you're out of luck and you're out of time. So get to work. And if you need help, I'm here to help you. All right, any other questions? That was a good one. Good, let's finally jump into chapter 7. So, to remind you, exam 2, the next one we're going to take, covers chapters 5, 6, and 7, meaning we are covering the last chapter for this exam. I wish I had dry erase markers, but I don't. Anyway, so we're on the last chapter for this exam. To remind you, I'm going to just write on this instead of the board since I don't have dry erase marker. We learned in chapter 5, I said that if there's anything, actually, we'll put it over here. If there's anything you need to remember from chapter 5, it's this. Cells need what to survive? What is their form of energy? What do they have to have, cells, what do they have to do their thing? Oxygen. But they do need oxygen. That is a correct statement. There's an even more correct statement. What is the one molecule? And you couldn't make this stuff without oxygen, so you're not wrong. But if I said there's one thing that you need to know from chapter 5, I mean, you need to know a lot. But if there's anything to remember, what is the one molecule that cells need for energy? Good. We learned from chapter 5 that cells need ATP. And again, there's a lot of other stuff you should know, but if there's, just make sure at least know that, right? So then the question is, how do we make ATP? Right? We break down glucose to make ATP. And what is the name of that process? What is that arrow where I'm saying, right, we break down glucose to make ATP. What do we call that process? Here's your hint. If there's anything that you need to remember from chapter 6 that we just finished, it's that. We break down glucose to make ATP. And there's a lot of other details in there that you should know, but if you don't remember anything else, remember that we break down glucose to make ATP. And what is the name of that process? We just finished it. We just had a whole chapter on it. Good. Cellular respiration is how we get from glucose to ATP. And now we're about to finish it up, and I'm going to tell you, the question now is, how do we make glucose? Well, we make it from carbon dioxide in a process called photosynthesis, right? I'm just going to put a P for abbreviation. So that's it. It's kind of working backwards, but if you don't remember anything else, remember that. Cells need ATP for energy. We get it in a process called cellular respiration. That's when we break down glucose to make make ATP. How do we make glucose? In a process called photosynthesis, which is chapter 7. So that's it. And again, I've said this before, but this might be a test question. Of the properties of life, basically these three chapters cover this one property of life, which is life needs energy, right? We need to transform energy from one form to another. That's what this whole exam is about. Chapters 5, 6, and 7. It's all about energy. So any questions about that? I'm not even going to play this little guessing game. Let's just move forward and talk about this. Let's talk about the basics of photosynthesis. This should be pretty quick and easy because chapter 6, before we even got into cellular respiration, if you remember, chapter 6 talked about the big overall picture, where you talked about how photosynthesis and cellular respiration were related. And we even talked a little bit, obviously, then about photosynthesis. So now you're just going to get some basically review with a little bit of new information. Here's a new word for you. You don't necessarily need to know it because I'm going to ask you what it means on the exam. But it is a word that I might use or that you might see written. So for that reason, you need to know what it is. A photoautotrough, well, your book gives some examples of what they are. Basically, it's anything that does photosynthesis, right? So that includes plants, which most of us think of, algae, which is what we're going to use for our experiments in lab this week. Some bacteria do photosynthesis. I'll put an X through that, only because that's an indication. I'm just letting you know I'm not going to test you on that. You don't need to know the examples of photoautotrophs. It's just there for your own information. As you already know, this was a pre-lab question. Photosynthesis transforms light energy into chemical energy. Some of you missed that, and then still haven't corrected it last time I checked. But yes, remember from chapter 5, as we know from the conservation of mass and energy, energy cannot be created or destroyed. So that was almost a trick question. I was hoping people just remember that. But yeah, photosynthesis does not create energy. It takes that light energy and converts it into chemical. That's an important concept. What do we use that light energy for, or excuse me, that chemical energy? These are just some examples from your book. I'm going to put it next to it because I'm not going to test you on it. Oh, come on, go back. There we go. So food, right? So if you eat a salad, tomatoes, any kind of plants, you are eating directly something that was photosynthesizing. If you eat an animal, like a cow or a chicken or pork, whatever, then you're eating an animal that ate something that photosynthesized, right? So that's very important. Without food, we'd be dead. Clothing's another one, right? So silk comes from animals. Cotton comes from plants. Those are just some examples. Wood obviously comes from trees. We wouldn't have a lot of buildings without that. Energy, especially here in West Virginia. Who knows where we get our energy? And this, like right now, this electricity, where did it come from? Coal, yeah. John Amos is the joke I always make with my son. He gets a kick out of that. But now I'm used to saying that instead of the right thing. John Amos Power Plant burns coal, right? And coal used to be old plants that got compressed and decomposed, and that's what that is. So eventually, when you go far enough back, that energy, that coal energy, was light energy, right? That was photosynthesis. Anyway, again, those are just examples. You don't need to know any of that for the exam. That is a good, decent independent work topic if you want to write about it. Because then literally you just list stuff off. Like, what are some foods that come directly from photosynthesis, right? Or what are some clothings that come from photosynthesis? Whatever. Energy. We talked about coal, but there's other ones. So, any questions about this slide? All right, the next slide I'm going to show you gives you some examples, as if you don't already know this. But these things right here, these green things on land, those are called plants, right? Wow, amazing. This thing right here, in the water, those are called photosynthetic protists. Specifically, that's kelp, which is a large multicellular algae. And then, of course, we've got some photosynthetic bacteria. You don't need to know any of that for the exam. It's just an example. What do they all have in common? They're green. We'll talk about that later. Why are they all green? You will learn soon. Probably already know, but we'll talk about it anyway. As a matter of fact, that'll be the next word for attendance. Green. All right, any questions so far? Okay. We're still doing the basics. I've used this word before. I told you this was going to be a test question. When I introduced you to the word mitochondria, I also told you there's something called chloroplast. Chloroplast is where photosynthesis happens. That will be a test question. Someone's going to get it wrong, and it's going to make me sad. It says the test question is going to say something like, blank happens in chloroplast and blank happens in mitochondria. And the answer is photosynthesis happens in chloroplast and cellular respiration happens in mitochondria. Someone's going to miss it. Or maybe you guys will be the first semester where someone doesn't miss it. I will be so excited and happy. So anyway, yes, chloroplasts. That's where photosynthesis happens. I'm going to show you some pictures of them later. You're going to get familiar with what they look like. Those are technically light-absorbing organelles, which makes sense, right? Because photosynthesis converts light energy to chemical energy, so we need something to absorb those that light energy. And your book also points out that it's found mostly in the interior cells of leaves. The most important thing you need to know for this, I'm going to circle it. If anything, that's what you need to know for the exam. Chloroplast is where photosynthesis happens. Like I've already said, you need to know that. Some of you might be familiar with that word. Some of you, that might be the first time you've heard that word. But I'm almost positive all of you have heard the next word, and you need to know what this means because I'm going to use it a lot. Chlorophyll. Does anybody know what chlorophyll is? You guys are too shy to answer? I know you know. Chlorophyll. It's green. It's a pigment. It's a green pigment. What is a pigment? Your book gives you the definition of a pigment. It is a light-absorbing molecule. So this chlorophyll, this light-absorbing molecule, plays a central role in converting solar energy into chemical energy. So again, to make sure you understand these words together, Chloroplast is where photosynthesis happens. It's an organelle, just like the mitochondria is an organelle where cellular respiration happens. Chloroplast is an organelle where photosynthesis happens. Within that organelle, within that chloroplast, there's these molecules, these pigment molecules called chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is the thing that's really absorbing the solar energy. Anyway, are there any questions about these two words? Pretty simple stuff. All right, the next word, I don't even know why your book even talked about it. Like, it's an important concept, I guess, if you're really studying plants, and obviously photosynthesis can't happen without this. But for Bio 101 students, you could go the whole semester and not know what this word means and you'd be fine. But just so you know, let's talk about what it is. Stomatas, those are tiny pores in leaves, so they're little bitty holes in the leaves. The same way we have holes in our face, so we can exchange gases, right? Because we need oxygen coming in, we need carbon dioxide going out. The same way we do that, leaves are the same way, right? They need carbon dioxide coming in, and they need oxygen to go out, and water. And that's how they do it. So we have face holes called mouths. They have a bunch of holes called stomatas. And again, I'm going to put a big X to this because I'm not going to ask you about that. And I don't even mention it again. I don't know why your book brings it up. I don't think it's that important. Not for this class. Has anyone ever heard of something called stigmata? It has nothing to do with biology. It's more of a religious thing. You can look that up if you want. Anyway, there's some people who like claim that they have, well, they have holes in their arms and their wrists, and they claim it's a holy thing, and they just woke up that way. Anyway, that's how I always remember the word stomata, because it sounds like stigmata, and stigmata is a bunch of holes in your hand, and stomata are holes in the leaves. All right, moving forward. Here's a word that I'm not going to ask you on the exam, but I'm going to use it, so you need to know what it is. Thylakoids. When I use this word, you need to know what it is. It's the membranes in the chloroplast where many of the reactions of photosynthesis occur. So again, chloroplast is that whole big organelle, with a bunch of them, where photosynthesis happens. Within that organelle, we've got some chlorophyll, right? That's the pigment molecule that I told you about. And now I'm telling you there's something called thylakoids. Those are just the membranes where this is happening. Your book points out that technically they're double membranes. That's not very important for the exam, but it is important as far as understanding how this works. Because if you remember from cellular respiration, there was a lot of function and form there, right? The form of the mitochondria is what enabled us to have ATP production, remember? Because we pumped hydrogen ions against their concentration gradient, and they got stuck in between the membranes, in between those two membranes. And there was a high concentration and then a low concentration. Because we were pumping them against their concentration. And then those hydrogen ions diffused back down, and that's how we made ATP. It was all about that double membrane, right? Well, the same thing is important here. We're still dealing with a double membrane. And spoiler alert, it does the same thing. We're still going to be pumping hydrogen ions in between those membranes. And we'll come to that. So if you're taking notes, no need to write that down yet. But yeah, as far as form and function are concerned, it's basically the same thing. At least that part of it. I won't take any questions yet because the next slide I'm going to show you is a visualization of this slide. Here we have a leaf, right? A photograph of a leaf. You've all seen a leaf before. Now we're going to zoom into this little spot of the leaf, and you can see these photosynthetic cells up top. You can see a vein where the water is. You can see at the bottom the stomata that we're talking about where the gas is exchanged. And then we can zoom in even more. So now, again, this is a cross-section of the leaf. Now each one of those little circles is a cell, right? It's one plant cell. So now we're going to zoom into this one plant cell, and that's what we're looking at. And then, if you look at this one plant cell, you can see a bunch of little green dots in that. And each one of those is the membrane. Excuse me, each one of those is the organelle called chloroplast. So then we can zoom into the chloroplast, at least have a drawing of it. No, we have a drawing in the picture. So we're zooming in. Again, this is one chloroplast. This is what it actually looks like. That's a drawing of it. You can see there's an inner and outer membrane again, and then there's the thylakoid membranes I told you about. Now, that's a lot of information. I'm going to put a big old X to this just to indicate that you don't necessarily need to know that for the exam. Again, I'm going to use the word thylakoid, and you just need to know what it means when I use it, but I'm not going to ask you what it means. And I'm not going to give you this picture and tell you, ask you to tell me the parts. I'm not going to say, all right, which part's the stroma, which part's the thylakoid, which part's the thylakoid space, what is a gram, right? I'm not gonna ask you any of that. And really, like I said, the only word I'm gonna use on here, well, other than photosynthesis and photosynthetic, would be thylakoid. So again, just know what I mean when I use that word. So any questions about that slide? All right, if you remember when we talked about respiration, I gave you the big picture, and then we kind of zoomed in, and then I gave you the details. And that's also how your book does it for photosynthesis too. I'm about to give you the big picture, and then we'll look at the details. And everybody studies their own way, but for the most part, I recommend studying this the same way I told you should study chapter 6, which is remember the big details, and then start adding in the little details. So the first thing you need to know is what I've already told you. Photosynthesis is the process that makes glucose. Memorize that. Once you have that memorized, then you can add some details. Like photosynthesis uses carbon dioxide to make glucose. But then once you have that memorized, photosynthesis uses carbon dioxide and energy from the sun to make glucose. And then once you have that memorized, you can say photosynthesis is the process that uses carbon dioxide and water to make, and light energy to make glucose. And then once you have that memorized, say the whole thing, but also, and it also produces oxygen, right? So that's how I recommend studying this. Add one fact at a time. And then once you have this memorized, then it's going to be a lot like the portion of the exam for cellular respiration, because it's going to be like this. In which stage is carbon dioxide used? In which stage is water produced? In which stage is light energy used? In which stage is glucose produced? And in which stage is oxygen produced? So the same way the exam is going to be for cellular respiration, right? Where I'm like, all right, which stage uses glucose in cellular respiration, right? And the answer is glycolysis. It's going to be the same kind of, same style for this portion of the exam too. Anyway, yeah, so as your book points out, we've got the reactants on the left, products on the right. You should know those. I'll put a question mark next to this, just like I did for photosynthesis or respiration. I'm not sure if I'm going to ask you these numbers. I don't necessarily know yet. I want you to know that for every 6 molecules of carbon dioxide and 6 molecules of water, we get 1 molecule of glucose and 6 molecules of oxygen. I'm not sure I'm going to ask you those numbers. But definitely know that we use carbon dioxide and water to make glucose and oxygen. And we use light energy to do it. So yeah, this whole process requires energy, which is interesting, right? So cellular respiration was all about making ATP, which is, in a sense, and we're not creating energy, but converting it from one form to another. In that case, it was still chemical. We were going from the chemical energy of glucose to the chemical energy of ATP. But the same thing happens here. So basically what we're doing in photosynthesis, we're using light energy to make the energy, chemical energy of glucose. But we can't do it directly. Even plant cells cannot take light energy and then just directly, boom, make glucose with it. We need an intermediate. We need a different kind of molecule that gives us energy. Can anybody guess what molecule these cells are going to use to build the glucose? No guesses? All right. Let it marinate as we move forward. Maybe it'll come to you. So, again, we're doing an overview of photosynthesis. But as I told you at the end of cellular respiration, I said once you have cellular respiration down and memorized, then photosynthesis should be a little bit easier, because basically photosynthesis is the opposite. Because remember, in cellular respiration, we had a fall of electrons, basically, right? I said glucose has these high energy electrons. And we break that down into pyruvate, and we break that down into citric acid, and then we put that in the citric acid cycle and break it down. And every time we broke it down, remember, we were pulling out these high energy electrons. So again, we go from high energy electrons, right? They came from the glucose, and those go down, and eventually the oxygen accepts it and becomes water. But in this case, it's the opposite. Water's like, hey, here's some low energy electrons. It gives them up, and that becomes then a molecule of oxygen. And in that process of photosynthesis, we energize those electrons, so we end up with high energy electrons. And of course, in cellular respiration, we release CO2, but in photosynthesis, we use CO2. And again, I would ask if you guys have questions, but I want to again remind you, this is just an overview. So there's no need to ask me any questions yet, because we're going to go into detail with this. And then once we get into detail, that's when you should ask me some questions. So the next slide I'm going to show you is, again, you should be familiar with it. It's from chapter 6. It is respiration. Like I said, we get these high energy electrons from glucose or from food, right? We strip them away in the first 2 stages of respiration, and then they go to the electron transport chain, where those electrons literally jump from protein to protein, and as they do, they release energy, right? So they're going from high energy to low energy. Where do the electrons come from? They come from glucose. Where do electrons go? That's a test question. They go to the oxygen. Once oxygen gets that, it becomes water, right? So that's respiration. And like I just said, photosynthesis is the opposite. Photosynthesis says, hey, here's some water. Water says, here, take some electrons. And as water gives up the electrons, it creates a molecule of oxygen. Then we use ATP energy, right? The arrow should go the other way. We use ATP energy to energize those electrons and to build the glucose. Anyway, here's the next important thing that you need to know for the exam. Well, first of all, does anybody remember how many stages were in cellular respiration? You should definitely have that memorized. Not only should you have that memorized, but you should know what they're called and what happens in each stage. But to remind you, to refresh your memory, cellular respiration was 3 stages: glycolysis, citric acid cycle, and electron transport chain. Photosynthesis is easier. There's only 2 stages, and you should know this. Study this, memorize this. Then once you have this memorized, then you can start memorizing the details. You can start memorizing what's the difference between light reactions and Calvin cycle. For now, just memorize the fact that photosynthesis occurs in 2 stages: light reactions and the Calvin cycle. How many of you have studied photosynthesis before? Okay, just one. So you don't answer this, because you might know it. Let's see if anyone else can guess this. Don't overthink it. Of these 2 stages, which one do you think directly uses the sun? Remember, I keep saying we use the sun for photosynthesis. Of these 2 stages, which one do you think uses the sun? Light reactions. How did you guess? It's amazing, right? Yes, light reactions. Now here's another one, and maybe you can remember my hint from respiration. Which one of these 2 stages uses carbon dioxide? Carbon with a C. No one remembers my hint, I guess. Good, Calvin cycle. Like I told you in respiration, when we talked about the citric acid cycle, I said anything with a C and has a cycle will be carbon dioxide. In respiration, the citric acid cycle produces carbon dioxide. In photosynthesis, the Calvin cycle uses carbon dioxide. So it's all there. Anyway, now that we've got that out of the way, let's put it in writing. Light reactions. Now, she already answered easily, right? Which of the 2 stages uses the sun? And the answer is light reactions, right? Because it's in the name, light reactions. Now, if you can remember that, and then you can remember that chlorophyll is a pigment, right? So pigments absorb light energy. Then hopefully that'll help you remember that chlorophyll is used in light reactions, because that will be a test question. Which of the 2 stages uses chlorophyll? The answer is light reactions. Actually, before I even get into this, let me break this down even in a bigger, easier way too. Because like I said, you should look at the big picture, memorize that before you start looking at the details. So again, to remind you, the whole purpose of photosynthesis is to build glucose, right? So it's basically, again, 2 stages. Calvin cycle is the part, that's the thing that actually does the building of the glucose, right? Calvin cycle makes the glucose. And it takes energy to do that. Where do we get the energy to do that? Light reactions. It's basically that simple. Calvin cycle makes the glucose. Light reaction provides that energy to the Calvin cycle to do that. And that should be easy for you to remember too, because remember, light is energy. If you can remember that light is energy, hopefully you can remember that basic information. The next word for attendance, I will circle it instead of saying it. I like to do that every once in a while. So that is the next word for attendance if you're online. So anyway, yes, going back to what we were saying, what's written on the board. Chlorophyll is used in light reactions. That's a test question. Chlorophyll obviously is the thing that absorbs the solar energy because it's a pigment. That's what pigments do. And here's something you should know. Chlorophyll converts that solar energy into, like I've already said, ATP. And something new. Now, I've never shown you this molecule before, NADPH. But I did tell you something that should tell you what this is. In chapter 6, we talked about two different molecules. And they were not this molecule, but they look very similar. And I said, whenever you see any molecule on this exam that looks anything like that, you should think of this. What is this? What does that molecule do? If anybody had to guess, even though I've never told you what that molecule is before. Does anybody know what that molecule does? All right, I gave you a hint. The one you've already learned about is this. That's supposed to be a D, not a P. NADH. And then you also learned about FADH2. So now that's it. That's the whole, all three of them. They all do the same thing, which is what? No guesses? Because you do need to know this. Those are the things that are moving around those high energy electrons, right? Because we keep talking about how electrons are important in this. That's the thing that's moving around the electrons. So you need to know that. NADH moves around electrons. FADH2 is the thing that's moving around electrons. Now the new one, NADPH, moving around electrons. You do not need to distinguish between the three. Again, when you see any molecule on the exam that looks like this, you should just automatically think, yep, that's the thing that's moving those electrons around. That's it. It's that simple. So anyway, we're still talking about the Leibniz reactions here. Again, chlorophyll is the thing that's absorbing the energy. It's the thing that's creating the ATP, right? Because the Calvin cycle is going to need some energy to build that molecule of glucose. It's also going to need some high energy electrons, and that's also coming from the Leibniz reactions. Where do those high energy electrons, where do those electrons come from? Comes from the water, like I've already said. Water is the thing giving up the electrons. And in the process, it produces oxygen. And you already know that because that is the opposite of cellular respiration. And I told you when I told you that in cellular respiration, that this will be the opposite. So in cellular respiration, again, oxygen absorbs those electrons and becomes water. In photosynthesis, water gives up the electrons and becomes oxygen. You need to know that for the exam. So there's all kinds of test questions right here. Which of the two stages uses chlorophyll? Light reactions. Which of the two stages absorbs solar energy? Light reactions. Which of the two stages produces ATP? Light reaction. Which of the two stages uses it? Calvin cycle. Which of the two stages produces high energy electrons? I might word it that way, or I might word it like this and say which of the two stages produces NADPH? Or maybe it'll say both. Which of the two stages produces high energy electrons in the forms of NADPH? The answer is light reactions. And then the counterpart to that, which of the two stages uses high energy electrons in the form of NADPH? And the answer is Calvin cycle. They go hand in hand. So remember, Calvin cycle is the thing that's making the glucose. It takes energy to do that, and it takes high energy electrons to do that. Where does the energy come from? Light reactions. Where do the high energy electrons come from? Light reactions. So the Calvin cycle is the thing squishing all those carbons together to make glucose. That's another test question too. Which of the two stages directly uses carbon dioxide? Calvin cycle. Like I've already asked earlier, which of the two stages uses ATP? Calvin cycle. Which of the two stages uses those high energy electrons? Calvin cycle. Any questions so far? To remind you, this is still just an overview. We haven't even gotten into details yet. This is just an overview. And again, everybody can study their own way, but my recommendation for most people is to study it the way I'm teaching it, the way your book is presenting it. Learn the big pictures, memorize the big picture, and then once you're confident that you have the big picture memorized, just start adding in details one at a time. Anyway, the next slide I'm going to show you is a picture of everything I just said. There is the chloroplast, where all this photosynthesis is happening. We need some high energy electrons. We need some energy in the form of ATP. Where do we get it from? Light reactions. Water's like, hey, here's some regular old electrons. Why don't you use some solar energy and excite them? And that's what we do, right? We get excited electrons, and NADPH captures them and takes them to the Calvin cycle. Calvin cycle's like, hey, thanks for the high energy electrons. I'm going to incorporate that into this molecule of glucose. But I need some energy to squish these molecules of carbon together. Where am I going to get that energy? From the ATP that was produced in the light reactions. Yep. So that's it. That's the overview anyway. Any questions about that? If you download the PowerPoint, and watch this animation that kind of shows photosynthesis in action. There's another word that I'm going to put a question mark. No, I'm going to put it next to this. I'm not going to ask you what this means on the exam. You should know what it means because I'm going to use it later in the semester, but I'm not going to ask you what it means. Carbon fixation. What is it? That is the incorporation of carbon from the air into organic compounds. So basically, when I say we're taking carbon dioxide out of the air to make glucose in photosynthesis, that is carbon fixation. As you might imagine, if we're taking carbon dioxide out of the air to do this, it reduces the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And also, as you might imagine, plants that are doing it, plants do this, right? So if you take away trees, right, if you have deforestation, that reduces the ability of the biosphere to absorb carbon. And of course, the opposite is true of this. If cutting down trees is bad because we're not taking carbon out of the atmosphere, then planting new trees has the opposite effect, right? It takes carbon out of the atmosphere. I'm gonna put it next to this whole slide. I mean, I guess this is a good time to talk about it because it is photosynthesis that allows carbon fixation to happen. But the idea of carbon fixation is not going to be important for this semester until at the end of the semester when we talk about the environment itself. And yeah, at that point, that would be very important. The whole reason we can live on Earth is because we have carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and that keeps the temperature warm enough where we can live. We can have life as we know it. Of course, if we have too much carbon dioxide, things will get too hot. That's not good, and we'll talk about that in a different chapter. So, any questions about this slide? All right. Now that was it for the overview of photosynthesis. And before we can even get into the exact process of photosynthesis, your book wants to give you some other background information, like the nature of sunlight. And if you've done the pre-lab, you already know a little bit about the nature of sunlight. Then we're also going to talk about chloroplast pigments, because remember, those are the things doing the work. And then we're going to learn how photosystems, finally, we'll learn how photosystems harvest light energy, and then how the light reactions generate ATP and NADPH. So let's jump into it. First thing you need to know is that sunlight is a type of energy called radiation, or more importantly, I'll underline it, electromagnetic energy. So sunlight is it's a type of electromagnetic energy. And you're probably familiar with a lot of electromagnetic energy. UV rays, right? The stuff that burns you, it destroys your skin cells. That's a type of electromagnetic energy. X-rays, so when you go to the dentist, you gotta put on that lead thing to protect you. That is a type of electromagnetic energy. Microwaves, right? So when you cook your popcorn for a movie night, that is electromagnetic energy. Radio waves, so when you listen to the radio in your car, electromagnetic energy. This is all different types of electromagnetic energy. This is also a decent independent work topic too. So we humans, we can only see visible light. Humans cannot, how do I put this? Yeah, let's just leave it at that. We can only see visible light. Some animals can see different things. Some of them can see more UV, which is a higher up the scale, right? Some animals can see infrared. And we can only see a certain amount of numbers. Some animals see the same range that we do, but they see more colors because they have more cones, more rods, one of the two. Anyway, it's not important, but you can look it up for independent work if you want. Not everything sees the things the way we do. Humans see things one way, and some humans also have mutations where they see things different than the rest of humans. So it's worth looking into if you want. Anyway, a little bit less important for us anyway is that light acts as waves. You don't want to put it next to that because you don't need to know that. If we were having a real physics discussion, that would be very important, but we're not. But your book brings it up, so do I. Your book also points out that the distance between the crests of two wavelengths, because like I said, it acts as waves, the distance between the crests of two waves is called wavelength. You don't need to know that. And then another thing you don't need to know, but again, it was in the book, so I included it. The full range of radiation is called the electromagnetic spectrum. So everything from the highest energy, which is gamma rays, all the way down to the lowest, which is radio waves, and everything in between, that is called the electromagnetic spectrum. You don't need to know that. So for the exam, in this slide, if there's anything you need to know that sunlight is a type of energy called electromagnetic energy. Any questions about that? All right. Here is something very, very important, especially when we're considering the last experiment, the fourth experiment in the lab this week. When light shines on a pigment, certain wavelengths, i.e. colors, are absorbed and disappear, and others are reflected. So if we all look at black in the back, because it rhymes, what color shirt is she wearing? She's wearing red. She's wearing it, so she knew. The rest of you guys aren't art majors, I get it. You might not understand. She's wearing a red shirt. Anyway, the reason that you look at her and see red is because light is hitting her shirt. It's absorbing every single color except red. So red is the one color bouncing off her shirt and hitting our eyeballs, and that's why it appears red to us. That's why when you wear something black outside, you get hotter than when you wear something white. Because black means it's absorbing all the colors. White means it's reflecting all the colors. So yeah, her shirt is red because it's absorbing every color except red. So what color are most trees? Or look at the grass. What color is the grass right now? Green, right? So what does that mean? What color is grass reflecting back to us? Green, right? It's reflecting back to us green. That's why it appears green to us. It is absorbing every single color except green. Therefore, if you think about it, we know that green plants are reflecting green light back to us, so they absorb every single color except green. If you had to guess, based on that information, what color do you think would be the worst for photosynthesis? No guesses? Are you just too shy to say it? Afraid of being wrong? No, red's not. It's a good guess because I was talking about red. But the answer is green, right? Because if you look at it, it's green. The reason it's green is because it's absorbing every single color except green. So if you were to give a plant a green light, you're giving it the one color it can't absorb. Think about it like that. Based on this information, strictly on this information, green would be, hypothetically, green should be the worst color for photosynthesis.
So
Now-
that's why UV light is so good for it.
That's a good question. The only way UV light would be good for it is if the pigments that are in it absorb UV light. So that's a good photosynthesis, or excuse me, good independent work question. Can they absorb UV light? I'll tell you for the exam, you don't need to know that green is the worst color. I just wanted to put that out there for the sake of the lab. So your question, you don't need to know for the exam, but it's worth looking into for independent work. Same thing with infrared, right? Can it absorb infrared? Or are there different plants that absorb different colors? Something to look into. But also, anyway, going back to what I was saying, like I just told you, based on this information, green should be the worst color for photosynthesis. You could also look at it like this, and somebody did say this in the pre-lab. I was impressed because I hadn't taught you yet. But somebody said they think that the blue light would be best out of the four lights because it has the highest energy. And they are correct. It does have the highest energy. This is all about energy. So based on that information, you would expect blue to be the best, right? Because it is the highest energy. And you would expect red, like he guessed, red to be the worst because it's the lowest energy. But that's what we're doing experiments for. We're going to find out. Because that's two different rationales, right? Based on the energy, we would say blue is best and red is worse. But based on the fact that plants are green and that's the one light that they can't absorb, we would say green is the worst. Also, another hint, something to consider for this experiment. White light is white because it is all the colors. So when you think about it like that one, you think about that based on this information and based on this information, we should guess that white light is the best light for photosynthesis. Because first of all, it's all the colors, right? So it's giving you everything, meaning high energy and low energy, the things it's absorbing, things that it's not absorbing, it's giving all. So anyway, just something to consider when you do your experiment. Are there any questions about that? All right, moving forward, again, your book always does this, The Process of Science. I'm going to skip it every chapter. You can read into it. It's funny too, because this chapter is basically what you're going to do in class, in lab. he basically did this experiment where he's looking to see, does the color of light affect the rate of photosynthesis? Of course, he did it a different way. Like we are looking at the pH of the water, right? Because if it gets acidic, that means respiration is happening. If it gets basic, that means photosynthesis is happening. That's how we're doing it. This person just looked at bacteria, right? So there's photosynthetic bacteria. A lot of them are growing in this area. A lot of them are growing in this area. Hardly none were growing in this area. Therefore, you could observe, or you could say that green and a little bit of yellow was the worst color for photosynthesis, based on his experiment. All right, anyway, moving forward. The next word for attendance is going to be light. We're almost done. Let's really quickly talk about chloroplast pigments. It's the last thing we'll talk about today. And it's going to be quick because I've already pretty much said this. So this is a review. This is just, now let's put it in writing, everything we've already said. The selective absorption of light by leaves is why they appear green. That's the book way of saying what I've already said, which is that leaves appear green because they absorb every single color except green. Green light is the one that's poorly absorbed. Green light is the one that's being reflected back to your eyeballs, right? So that's why it appears green. As you already know from chapter 5, energy cannot be created or destroyed. So the energy that's been absorbed has to be converted to other forms. So all that light energy is absorbed, something has to happen to it. And that's what we're about to talk about. Here's a picture of what we already said. So here's the light, right? The white light hitting the leaves. All the colors are being absorbed except green. Green's the thing that's being reflected back. That's why it appears green to us. Here's some new information that you sort of need to know. You need to know these three things, but you do not need to differentiate between the three. So just know that they exist, but you don't need to know the difference between the three. So again, we're talking about chloroplasts, right? We're talking about these things, these organelles where photosynthesis happens. And I'm now telling you that there's stuff other than just chlorophyll. Technically, there's chlorophyll A, there's chlorophyll B, and then there's a third pigment called carotenoids. And we're talking about each one of them specifically. First of all, we're talking about chlorophyll A. That is the one that participates directly in the light reactions. So that's the main guy right there. That's the thing absorbing all that sunlight other than green, right? And just so you know, I'm going to put it next to this because, again, you don't have to differentiate between the two. The chlorophyll A absorbs mainly blue-violet light and red light. That's its main job. As you might imagine, chlorophyll B absorbs different lights, which makes sense, right? Because it's teamwork. Chlorophyll A is like, all right, I've got these lights. Chlorophyll B says, all right, I've got these lights. The carotenoids say, okay, I have these lights, and then together they make a great team. But anyway, that's chlorophyll A. Any questions about chlorophyll A? All right, chlorophyll B, it absorbs mainly blue and orange light. Like I said, I'm not going to ask you that. And that's more of a secondary thing, right? So chlorophyll A is doing the big work. Chlorophyll B is conveying the absorbed energy to chlorophyll A. So chlorophyll A is like, it's doing all the work. Chlorophyll B gets a little bit of energy, says, hey, thanks, and it passes it along to chlorophyll A. And again, you don't need to know those details. It's just for your own information. And then the more interesting one, in my opinion, especially considering last week was the first week of fall, carotenoids. First of all, these things absorb mainly blue-green light. Again, you don't need to know that. And why? One of the reasons I think they're interesting, carotenoids are sort of like the sunblock of the leaves. These are the things that absorb and dissipate excessive light energy that might damage the chlorophyll. So that's something to think about too. The first experiment in this lab we're doing says, does light intensity affect photosynthesis? And a lot of you hypothesize that yes, as light intensity increases, so does photosynthesis. And that's logical. But then I probably left comments on yours if you said that and said, all right, it's just something to think about. No need to change your answer. But there has to be a point where too much light, or when you get to a certain level of light where it's too much light, right? And that's true, because too much light can harm the chlorophyll. So you might know some of these carotenoids because we eat them and they're good for you. Beta carotene, that's orange stuff, red stuff. Lycopene, that's red stuff. and you're probably more familiar with them for this right here. Fall, the fall colors, right? That's the carotenoids. So right now, all these leaves that are green, they have this in them, but what happens is in the fall, the green disappears, and that's what's left. And that's where we get our fall color from. Like I said, all three of these pigments act as teams, right? So this is what chlorophyll A absorbs, this is what chlorophyll B absorbs, this is what carotenoids absorb. So you can see together, they do a good job of absorbing different wavelengths. Of course, none of them do a good job of green, like we've already mentioned. All right, so when we get back on Wednesday, we will talk about how photosystems harvest light energy. That's it. I guess, that'll be it. Everybody have a great week. Don't forget, if you're meeting online or in person, get extra points now.
What are the grades?
Stop recording. It's a secret. I don't want anybody online knowing.